I thought I knew everything about my uncle, until that summer changed everything. Alone in his house, a single moment made my heart race and my world spin. The way he looked at me, the touch of his hand, it was more than I could handle. I wasn't prepared for what would come next. What I saw, what I felt, it broke every rule I thought I could never cross. It all started innocently enough. My uncle, Ethan, invited me to spend the summer at his home while my parents were traveling. Ethan, at 36, was the epitome of charm and sophistication. He lived alone in a sleek, modern apartment that reflected his personality, organized, stylish, but still warm and welcoming. I hadn't seen him in years, but I remembered him as the fun uncle who always made time to joke around with me as a kid. I thought a summer with him would be a welcome break from my usual routine. Ethan wasn't just any uncle, he was magnetic. His athletic build and confident demeanor always seemed to draw people in effortlessly. I admired how he carried himself, with a casual confidence that made him approachable yet undeniably striking. He had this laugh that could light up a room and a habit of speaking with such sincerity that it made you feel like the most important person in the world. Over the years, life had kept us apart, but this summer was supposed to be our chance to reconnect. I arrived at his place feeling both excited and a little nervous. The moment I stepped inside, I was struck by how perfectly everything was arranged. His home was immaculate, with sleek furniture, soft lighting, and hints of his personality scattered throughout. Framed photos of his travels, books on philosophy and history, and even a guitar propped up in the corner. It was a space that felt alive, warm, and comforting. At first, everything seemed normal. We laughed over dinner, caught up on each other's lives, and spent evenings watching movies or talking late into the night. But as the days passed, I began to notice little things. How his gaze lingered just a moment too long, how his touch would feel electric even in the most innocent of moments, and how my own heart raced whenever he was near. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, but it grew with each passing day. Looking back, maybe I should have left as soon as I started feeling that way. But I stayed. And as I stood on the edge of something I couldn't name, I didn't realize just how far I was about to fall. The summer days seemed perfect on the surface, but beneath the laughter and the relaxed atmosphere, something was beginning to change. At first, I chalked it up to my overactive imagination. Ethan's easy charm and natural confidence made it hard not to admire him. But soon, admiration gave way to something deeper, something I couldn't quite name, and didn't want to admit. It started with small things. A glance held a second too long. The way his hand brushed mine when passing the salt at dinner. The moments when he'd sit a little closer than necessary on the couch while we watched movies. I told myself it was all in my head. He was just being the same thoughtful, kind person he'd always been. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting, and I couldn't tell if it was just me, or if he felt it too. One night, we were sitting on the patio, sipping wine and talking about his favorite travel stories. The air was warm, the city lights twinkling in the distance, and his voice was steady and calm, like it always was. But as he leaned back in his chair, stretching slightly, his shirt shifted, revealing a glimpse of the toned muscles beneath. My gaze lingered longer than it should have, and when I finally looked up, I caught him watching me. He didn't say anything, just smiled soft and knowing, as though he could read my thoughts. My face flushed, and I quickly looked away, but the moment stayed with me. It wasn't just his look that unnerved me, it was the way it made me feel. My heart raced, and my palms grew clammy, as if I had crossed some invisible line just by holding his gaze. The tension between us grew in subtle ways after that night. He began to touch me more often, a hand on my shoulder when he walked past, a casual brush of his fingers against mine when we talked. Every touch felt deliberate, even if it was fleeting. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that I was imagining it. But deep down I knew I wasn't. Then there were the late nights when we'd stay up talking until the early hours. He'd share stories from his past, his voice low and intimate, as though we were the only two people in the world. I hung on to every word, feeling more connected to him than I'd ever felt to anyone before. It scared me how much I craved those moments, how much I looked forward to the sound of his laugh or the way his eyes lit up when he smiled. But it wasn't all innocent. One evening, while clearing the table after dinner, his hand lingered on mine as I handed him a plate. It was a simple gesture, but the warmth of his touch sent a shiver through me. I looked up, and for a moment, neither of us moved. The air between us felt charged, as though something unspoken was trying to break free. I started noticing other things, how he'd find reasons to sit closer, how his compliments felt more personal, more pointed. "You look really good today," he'd say, his voice low and genuine, and I'd feel my stomach flip. Or, "You've really grown up," accompanied by a look that made me question what he meant. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it, how his voice seemed to wrap around me, leaving me both exhilarated and terrified. I wanted to ignore it, to push it all aside, but the tension was impossible to escape. It followed me everywhere, lingering in every conversation, every shared glance. And with each passing day, I found it harder to pretend nothing was happening. Something was building between us, something I couldn't control and wasn't sure I wanted to. As the summer wore on, the unspoken tension between Ethan and me became impossible to ignore. It lingered in the quiet moments, like when we sat on the couch watching a movie, our shoulders brushing against each other. The simple contact set my skin alight. It was no longer just the innocent connection of family. It had evolved into something far more complicated and far more dangerous. One evening, after a long day of running errands, Ethan suggested we unwind with a glass of wine. The kitchen was dimly lit, the warm glow of the pendant lights casting soft shadows. I was at the sink rinsing glasses when he came up behind me. His presence was so close I could feel the heat radiating from his body. "You've been such a help this summer," he said, his voice smooth and low. I turned to face him, and for a moment, we were closer than we'd ever been before. His eyes searched mine, and I felt as if he were looking right through me, peeling back every layer of my resolve. My heart pounded as he reached out and brushed a strand of hair from my face. His fingers lingered just a second too long. "You're really something," he murmured, almost as if to himself. I couldn't respond. My breath caught in my throat, and all I could do was stand there, frozen between wanting to step back and the magnetic pull drawing me closer. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the moment over and over in my mind. His touch, his voice, it was all consuming. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it didn't mean anything, but deep down I knew it did. I wasn't imagining the way his gaze lingered, the way his tone softened when he spoke to me. And I hated how much I wanted it. The next day, I resolved to keep my distance. I needed clarity, space to figure out what was happening. But fate had other plans. As I headed to the living room, I saw Ethan lying on the couch, his head tilted back, eyes closed, the soft rise and fall of his chest mesmerizing. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, casting a golden glow over him. I stood there, rooted to the spot, unable to look away. Before I could think better of it, I found myself moving closer. My hands trembled as I reached out, placing them lightly on his shoulders. His eyes fluttered open, and for a heartbeat neither of us spoke. "That feels good," he finally said, his voice rough and low. Emboldened by his reaction, I began kneading the tension out of his muscles. His skin was warm beneath my touch, and I could feel the stress melting away from his body. It should have stopped there, but it didn't. The air between us grew thick, charged with something neither of us dared to name. His breathing slowed, and as I leaned in to whisper something, anything to break the silence, he turned his head, and our faces were suddenly inches apart. His gaze locked onto mine, intense and searching. My heart raced, and before I could stop myself, I pressed my lips to his cheek. The moment hung in the air, suspended in time. I expected him to pull away, to laugh it off, but instead he turned toward me, his lips brushing against mine. The kiss was tentative at first, almost as if he was testing the waters. But when I didn't pull back, it deepened, becoming something neither of us could deny. His hands found my waist, pulling me closer, and I could feel the strength in his grip, the heat of his body against mine. From that moment, there was no turning back. The line we'd been tiptoeing around had been crossed, and there was no pretending it hadn't happened. Every glance, every touch from that point on carried a new weight. It was as though we were caught in a storm, unable to escape, but unwilling to let go. That night, as we sat together on the couch, the closeness between us felt almost unbearable. He placed his hand on mine, his thumb tracing soft circles over my skin. "This isn't supposed to happen," he said quietly, his voice tinged with guilt. I knew he was right, but I couldn't bring myself to agree. Instead, I leaned my head on his shoulder, silently willing him to stop overthinking and just let the moment be. His arm wrapped around me, pulling me closer, and I felt a sense of safety I hadn't realized I craved. The world outside seemed to fade away, leaving just the two of us in that small, enclosed space. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to let go of all the doubt and fear, to just feel. The forbidden nature of it all only made it more intoxicating. Every whispered word, every stolen glance, Every tentative touch added to the tension, pulling us deeper into something neither of us fully understood. We didn't talk about what it meant or where it was going. We simply existed in the moment, letting the unspoken connection between us speak louder than words ever could. The night it all came to a head started like any other. We had dinner together, the usual banter and light conversation filling the space between us. But there was an undercurrent, a tension neither of us acknowledged but both felt acutely. It hung in the air, heavier than ever, and I could sense that something was going to happen. I just didn't know what. After dinner, Ethan suggested we watch a movie. We settled on the couch, the distance between us smaller than before. I told myself it was innocent, just two people sharing a space. But as the movie played, I became hyper-aware of every little thing. The warmth of his arm brushing against mine, the way his breathing slowed during quiet scenes, the subtle shifts in his posture that brought us closer together. At one point, I turned to make a comment about the movie, and our eyes met. The words caught in my throat as I realized just how close we were. His gaze held mine, searching, questioning, as if he were looking for permission to cross the line we'd been dancing around all summer. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. Without thinking, I leaned in, closing the small gap between us. Our lips met, tentative at first, but quickly deepening as the weight of our suppressed feelings came rushing to the surface. It was as though a dam had broken, and everything we'd been holding back poured out in that moment. His hands found my face, pulling me closer, and I felt the heat of his body against mine. "Are you sure about this?" he whispered, his voice low and filled with uncertainty. I didn't answer with words. Instead, I nodded, my breath catching as I moved closer, straddling his lap. The hesitation in his eyes faded, replaced by something deeper, something primal. He kissed me again, his hands running down my back, and I felt as though I was melting into him. But as lost as we were in the moment, reality was about to intrude in the most jarring way. Just as things began to escalate, a sudden knock at the door shattered the quiet. We froze, our breaths heavy, our bodies still entwined. Ethan's eyes widened in panic as the knocking grew louder. "Wait here," he said, his voice barely a whisper as he gently pushed me off his lap and stood to answer the door. I scrambled to fix my appearance, my mind racing. Who could it be at this hour? My heart sank as I heard a familiar voice from the doorway. Ethan's best friend, Mark. "Hey man, sorry to drop by unannounced, but I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd say hi," Mark said, his tone casual but loud enough to carry into the living room. Ethan tried to sound normal, but I could hear the tension in his voice. "Oh, yeah, no problem. Come on in." My stomach twisted as I heard Mark's footsteps approaching. I had no time to think, no time to escape. By the time Mark entered the room, I was sitting on the couch, trying to look as casual as possible, though I could still feel the heat from Ethan's touch lingering on my skin. "Hey," Mark said, giving me a friendly nod before turning to Ethan. "Didn't know you had company." His tone was light, but there was a hint of curiosity in his eyes as he looked between us. "Yeah," Ethan said quickly, clearing his throat. "This is my niece. She's staying with me for the summer." I smiled awkwardly, trying to ignore the way my heart was racing. Mark seemed to accept the explanation, but I could tell he sensed something was off. He stayed for about an hour, chatting with Ethan while I sat silently, barely able to meet anyone's gaze. When he finally left, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The room fell silent as Ethan closed the door and leaned against it. He didn't look at me at first, his hands running through his hair as he let out a heavy sigh. "That was close," he muttered, more to himself than to me. The weight of what had just happened, and what had almost happened, hung between us like a storm cloud. I stood, crossing the room to him. "Ethan," I began, but he held up a hand to stop me. "We can't," he said, his voice firm but tinged with regret. Whatever this is, it's too risky. Too complicated." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I couldn't deny the truth in them. "I know," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't enough. The feelings I had for him weren't something I could just turn off, no matter how much I wanted to. He stepped closer, his hand reaching out to brush against mine. "You mean so much to me," he said, his voice softening. "But it's wrong. It's dangerous. If anyone found out." "I don't care about anyone else," I interrupted, my voice breaking. "All I care about is how I feel when I'm with you." For a moment, his resolve seemed to waver. He looked at me with such intensity that I thought he might give in. But then he shook his head, stepping back. "I can't do this," he said, his voice barely audible. "I won't." The finality in his tone cut deeper than I expected. I stood there, watching as he turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the living room. The weight of everything that had happened, and everything that hadn't, settled heavily on my chest. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the evening over and over in my mind. The kiss, the interruption, the look in Ethan's eyes as he pulled away. It all felt like a cruel dream I couldn't wake up from. The days that followed were tense and awkward. Ethan and I avoided being alone together as much as possible, our conversations reduced to polite small talk. But no matter how hard we tried to act normal, the connection between us remained, an unspoken truth neither of us could ignore. And though we never spoke of it again, I knew that night had changed everything. The feelings we had for each other, the lines we'd crossed, they couldn't be undone. No matter how hard we tried to pretend otherwise, we were no longer just uncle and niece. We were something else entirely. And that truth would haunt us both for a long time to come. After that night, everything felt different. It was like an invisible wall had gone up between us, even though we were still sharing the same space. Ethan avoided being in the same room with me for too long, and when we did speak, it was only about mundane topics, the weather, errands, or what to cook for dinner. The laughter and warmth that had once filled our conversations were gone, replaced by an uncomfortable silence that neither of us knew how to break. At first, I thought I could handle it. I told myself it was better this way, that we were doing the right thing by pretending nothing had happened. But as the days turned into weeks, the distance between us became unbearable. Every time I saw him, my heart ached with the memory of what we'd shared. The stolen kisses, the quiet moments when it felt like the rest of the world didn't exist. Ethan, on the other hand, seemed determined to put as much space between us as possible. He'd leave the apartment early in the morning and come back late at night, always with some excuse about work or errands. When he was home, he stayed in his room, the door firmly closed. It felt like he was trying to erase me from his life, and the thought of it made my chest tighten with a pain I couldn't describe. One evening, after days of barely seeing him, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I knocked softly on his bedroom door, my heart pounding in my chest. When he opened it, his expression was unreadable, part surprise, part apprehension, and something else I couldn't place. "We need to talk," I said, my voice trembling. He hesitated for a moment before stepping aside and letting me in. His room was dimly lit, the soft glow of a bedside lamp casting long shadows on the walls. I sat on the edge of his bed, my hands twisting nervously in my lap as I tried to find the right words. "I can't keep doing this," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. Pretending like nothing happened, like it didn't mean anything. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair as he leaned against the wall. "It's not that it didn't mean anything," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "It's that it meant too much. That's why this has to stop." I looked up at him, my eyes stinging with unshed tears. "But why does it have to stop? We didn't do anything wrong. We didn't hurt anyone." He shook his head, his expression pained. "It's not about what we've done. It's about what could happen, what people would say if they knew. It's about the fact that you're my niece, and I'm supposed to protect you, not." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see the guilt written all over his face, the way his shoulders slumped under the weight of it. But beneath the guilt, there was something else, a longing that mirrored my own, a silent acknowledgement of the connection we couldn't ignore no matter how hard we tried. "I don't care what people think," I said, my voice breaking. "I care about how I feel. And I care about how you feel. Doesn't that matter more than anything else?" He looked at me then, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and something deeper. "It does," he admitted, his voice soft. "But it doesn't change the fact that this isn't right. No matter how much we want it to be, it never will be." The finality of his words hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt the tears spill over, hot and unwelcome, as I stood and turned away from him. "If that's how you really feel," I said, my voice shaking, "then maybe I should leave." Ethan's silence was answer enough. I left his room that night feeling more alone than I ever had in my life. The next morning, I packed my bags, my heart breaking with every item I folded and tucked away. Ethan didn't try to stop me. He stood in the doorway, watching silently as I finished packing. When I turned to leave, he finally spoke. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely audible. "For everything." I nodded, unable to look at him. "So am I whispered before walking out the door. The ride home was a blur. I stared out the window, my mind racing with memories of the summer, the laughter, the quiet moments, the forbidden connection that had changed everything. I felt like I was leaving a piece of myself behind, and the pain of it was almost too much to bear. In the weeks that followed, we barely spoke. Ethan would text occasionally, short messages asking how I was, or letting me know he was thinking of me. But it wasn't the same. The connection we'd shared was still there, lingering in the background, but it was overshadowed by the weight of what we'd lost. I tried to move on, to focus on my life, and forget about the summer I'd spent with Ethan. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't. The memories of him, his smile, his touch, the way he made me feel, were burned into my mind, impossible to erase. And though I knew we'd made the right decision, it didn't make the pain any easier to bear. The weeks after I left Ethan's apartment stretched into months, and the raw intensity of what had happened between us began to fade. But only on the surface. Inside, the memories remained vivid, like a wound that refused to heal. The moments we had shared were still there, etched into my mind, but now they felt distant, like they belonged to another life. I threw myself into work, hobbies, and friendships, trying to distract myself from the ache in my chest. But no matter how busy I kept myself, there were still quiet moments when the memories crept in. I would hear a song we'd listened to together or catch a familiar scent that reminded me of him, and it would all come rushing back, the connection, the longing, and the heartache of knowing it was over. Ethan and I kept in touch sporadically. His texts were always polite, always careful, as though he were afraid of saying the wrong thing. "Hope you're doing well," he'd write, or, "Just wanted to check in." I would reply in kind, never letting on how much I missed him, how much I wanted to ask if he missed me too. But even as the pain lingered, I began to see the situation more clearly. What had happened between us wasn't just a mistake. It was a choice we had both made, born out of loneliness, curiosity, and a longing for connection. It was easy to label it as wrong, to focus on the taboo nature of it, but at its core, it had been something deeply human. Two people, both searching for something they couldn't name, had found it in each other. That realization didn't make it any easier to accept, but it helped me understand that what we had shared wasn't something to be ashamed of. It wasn't something I could explain to anyone else. Not my friends, not my family, and certainly not to him. But it was ours. And for all its complications, it had been real. Over time, I found a strange kind of peace in that understanding. The guilt and shame that had once consumed me began to fade, replaced by a quiet acceptance. I couldn't change what had happened, and I couldn't undo the feelings I'd had for Ethan. But I could learn from it. I could take the lessons it had taught me about boundaries, about vulnerability, and about the importance of understanding myself. Looking back, I realized that summer had been a turning point in my life. It forced me to confront parts of myself I hadn't wanted to see. My loneliness, my need for connection, and my tendency to look for validation in the wrong places. And though it had been painful, it had also been transformative. Ethan and I never spoke openly about what had happened again. The unspoken agreement between us seemed to be that it was better left in the past, as a memory we could each carry quietly. The distance between us remained, but there was no animosity. If anything, there was a strange sense of gratitude for the connection we had shared, fleeting though it had been. Now, as I reflect on that summer, I don't feel regret. I feel a bittersweet mix of emotions, a lingering ache for what was lost, but also a deep sense of gratitude for what I gained. The experience taught me more about myself than I could have imagined, and for that, I am thankful. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that life is messy. Relationships are messy. And sometimes, the connections we form with others don't fit neatly into the boxes society creates for them. But that doesn't make them any less real or meaningful. And though Ethan and I have gone our separate ways, the memory of that summer will always stay with me. A reminder of how deeply we can feel, how complicated life can be, and how even the most forbidden moments can shape us in ways we never expected. If you were in their position, what would you have done? Do you believe in forbidden love, or is the risk never worth it? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that challenge the rules we live by. Trust me, you won't want to miss the next one. It's even more shocking than this. Stay tuned.